Okay, well, I'll go ahead and start. Before introducing Professor Lucy, let me explain the structure of today's colloquium. After the talk, there will be some time for questions and answers. So to simplify this, please send your questions through the chat once the talk is complete so that we can pose them to the speaker. Also, please turn off your cameras to improve the quality of the image and sound and put less strain on the internet connection. Professor John Lucy received a Ph.D. in Human Development from the University of Chicago in 1987. He's taught in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania and is currently the William Benton Professor Emeritus in the Departments of Comparative Human Development and of Psychology at the University of Chicago, and an associate faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for Latin American Studies. His work is outstanding because of its relevance and integration of theoretical perspectives and methods across anthropology, psychology, and linguistics. And this is not just in theory. He's conducted over 30 years of ethnographic, linguistic, and psychological research among the Mayan-speaking people of the Yucatan region of Mexico. Lucy's research focuses on the relation between language and thought, and especially on the role that language plays in shaping thought. In his early work, he set the standard for research on linguistic relativity, the proposal that particular language that we speak influences the way we think. And this work appeared in 2 volumes, both published in 1992. And his later work has added a developmental perspective, exploring how languages come to influence thought during middle childhood specifically. And more recently, he's been exploring the role that linguistic relativity plays in second language acquisition and language standardization. Lucy's work has been widely recognized. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Mellon Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and on 3 occasions, a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen. He's received major research grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Institute of Mental Health, the Department of Education, the Social Science Research Council, and the Spencer Foundation. He's also served numerous roles in his fields, including at the University of Chicago as chair of the Department of Comparative Human Development, master and deputy dean of the Social Sciences, and as coordinator of the Indigenous language programs in the Center for Latin American Studies. And to add just a brief personal note, I was introduced to Lucy's work as I developed my own doctoral research on language, cognition, and environmental practice among Quechua speakers in the Peruvian Andes. And his work confirmed to me that it's not only necessary, but also possible to bring together the insights of these 3 fields, anthropology, linguistics, and psychology, which don't always see eye to eye. Lucy's work stands alongside only a few others as testament to the fact that yes, it's both feasible and intellectually productive to think and work across these disciplinary boundaries. So without further ado, thank you all for attending this talk, and please welcome Professor John Lucy with a warm round of hand clapping emojis.
Thank you very much, Josh, for inviting me, and you, Ian, too, for helping me set up. I guess it's the deaf community that does the applause like this that we should be borrowing from. Can you hear me okay? If you give me a nod, then I know my voice is carrying through. Good. I'm going to talk today about the influence of language on thought, relativity, acquisition, and standardization. And I know that Josh mentioned that I've worked on this for a long time, but I wanted to say here that people have many views about this topic. Some people think there's no distinction between language and thought. Some believe they're entirely separate and never and don't influence each other at all. Others think the directionality runs from thought to language and the other from language to thought. I choose this one here because it's what I work on, but also over historical time was one had the least evidence, actual empirical evidence for it. But I don't discount the others. I think there are interactions, all directions. There are some autonomous areas and so forth. I put 3 topics in: relativity, acquisition, and standardization. And it was, as mentioned in the introduction, I've been working on those topics more or less in that order. But I'm trying today to not just talk about different disciplines of anthropology, psychology, linguistics, but also within anthropology, to touch on topics I think are relevant to people who work on physical or biological anthropology, cultural comparative, those who work in archaeology, although that'll be a smaller part of this particular talk, but also people who work in applied areas of anthropology and education, language standardization, and certain things of that sort. So I'm trying to reach that. Let me begin then by saying that in the world I inhabit, I think of three different kinds of language effects on thought. The first is what I call the semiotic level. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I got feedback for a moment. I didn't know if it was me. The semiotic level is whether or not it's talking about whether the species has symbolic language or not, and whether that makes a difference for how we think versus other species who do not have symbolic thought. So it has implications for the phylogenesis of the species, for the development of the child, and for the functioning of people with impairments of various types that block their access to or ability with language. The second type of language effects are structural, and that's where we talk about differences among the languages in their grammar and their vocabulary and so forth. And this is really a culture comparative problem. It's cross-linguistic, and we also have some historical issues, and we can bring in questions about modality as well nowadays. We talk about whether people communicate with signs or literacy and so forth. Finally, there are functional differences, and that's differences in the uses of language, which societies erect through their institutions over time, literacy, schooling, and standardization, but there are many others, imposition of prestige varieties. We don't know, but people argue that there are relativity effects here as well, okay, and this is what I want to talk about later on. So although I presented these in a logical order, from the species up to cultural variation, up to institutional developments in history, I actually did the research in the order that was laid out in the introduction, which is I looked first at structural issues, so-called linguistic relativity, how language differences across cultures affect thought. Then I moved on to language acquisition work, looking to use relativity actually to understand child development, to make a contribution to separating language and thought. Because the child gets both all the time together, it's very hard within a field of like psychology and experimentation to ever separate these out. But in this cultural comparison, we have the opportunity to discuss different endpoints and then sort things out. And finally, in recent years, I'll talk at the end of this talk, as much as I can anyway, about language standardization. And with standardization here, I mean to encompass the wide range of things which societies try to organize language practices for certain functional institutional ends. Schooling, literacy, and so forth would fall in here. They're not all about language, but they are basically historically developed in many cases in order to, literacy promotes standardization. The need to acquire literacy gets schooling. Schooling then enhances the standardization of what the correct language is, and these are all interrelated structural institutions. And I want to use relativity to think about some of the issues in that area. So first I want to compare English, American English and Yucatec Maya. Let me give a brief moment of comment on my field site. Alas, Josh, I've worked here over 40 years, over 30 years. So I work in the northeast part of the peninsula of Yucatan. It's the Yucatec Maya is spoken by about over 800,000 people now. The number of monolinguals has declined, but because the population has grown, the number of total speakers has gone up. It's one of the Mayan languages, and the patterns I'm going to discuss today hold not only for the other Maya languages, but they'll also hold broadly throughout much of Mesoamerica and beyond. I work in a small village there. When I first went in, you really couldn't get in. Every couple of days there was a truck that would go over. It took 3 hours to get there. Very remote. It looks much more prosperous today. You can get in and out very quickly. But this gives you a sense. It was an old colonial center, and people lived in the traditional thatched huts in a very simple environment. This will come up a little bit later in discussing some of the issues that might explain the results other than the language variables. And daily life, the picture on the left shows a woman cooking tortillas. It was traditionally a corn swidden agriculture location, subsistence pattern. And the picture on the right, I've had a guy in his little triciclo going around peddling goods. People now sell and work in Cancun on the coast. So there's a lot of influence from the outside world. I can get an internet connection there. People learn Spanish in school. It's a much more complicated place than it used to be verbally and culturally. It's sort of halfway into the modern world and halfway not. I want to contrast two aspects of the language having to do with number marking. The first part I'll talk about is pluralization and attention to number. What I'm interested in here is describing a language difference and then developing a measure of that, a psychological measure of that. You could just look at the language and on the basis of the language say, this is how people are thinking. But in that case, you've essentially collapsed language and thought into the same thing, and you're using the same database to say, this is what the language is and this is what they say. So that may be true at some level, that when you are talking, you are actually thinking that way. But from a scientific point of view, you have to separate these two. So it's a methodological issue then to create a measure of thinking, memory, classification, similarity judgment, whatever you might have, that will have some autonomy from the speech act itself. It's not a claim that that thinking always occurs without speech or never occurs with speech. It's a claim that from a methodological point of view, you simply must have a separate measure. And we could talk more about that if people have questions. So Yucatec has a pattern that we'll look at first very similar to you. Here's the word 𝗏𝑘𝑛, which means pig, and 𝗏𝑘𝑛𝗏𝗏, which means pigs. And I chose a word here, 𝗏𝑘𝑎n, which is hammock, or 𝗏𝑘𝑎n𝗏𝑏, which is hammocks. And so this looks like English, right? You have a singular and you add this little _ob thing on instead of an S, and it looks like, you know, we've got the right thing. But as you speak the language, you realize there's an issue, which is that 𝗏𝑘𝑛 can mean pigs. You don't even need the plural. And 𝗏𝑘𝑎n can mean hammocks. It's a little odd, but you can do it. And this is a pattern, this pattern of using the form, ignoring the plural, which isn't just true of Yucatec, but other Maya languages, other languages in Mesoamerica, all through the Far East. This optionality of plural is present in languages, China, Japan, and so forth. It's maybe a third or maybe half of the languages of the world have a pattern of this type. It's not a rare, odd beast, okay? This chart is a little complicated, but let me walk you through it. If we divide the kinds of objects in the world, look at just at the referent line here. And we say that in the world, there are animals, there are objects, and there are materials. If we could just use these three categories for a moment. I put the linguistic terminology above, but you don't need to pay attention to that right now. What we would see is that English would pluralize animates when needed, and it would pluralize objects when needed, but it wouldn't pluralize plurals. And I'll give examples of that. I mean, materials. I'll give an example. Yucatec doesn't need to pluralize anything, but it optionally pluralizes animals, human beings, pigs, and things like that. But it would not pluralize an object typically. It has to really be a focus, a construction of some type. And it would never do it for materials either, unless it was an extremely special meaning. I mean, I sat with informants and tried to come up with examples. It's a lot of fun, but it's a little cuckoo because no one actually talks that way. So I want to compare these little 4 boxes on the corner, the 3 no's and the 1 white plural one, and ask what could be going on. And whether or not we could find a way of testing whether this difference in where you apply plurals and how much you apply them would have some effect. Let's think about this from a cross-linguistic point of view. And this is a typological point of view. If we take these 3 referent types, animals, objects, and materials, and we think of them as corresponding to noun types, the first little graph here shows what I would propose to be a cross-linguistic universal, okay? And that is that you're very likely to put a plural on the A-type things, the animals, less likely on the B, and very unlikely on the C. And that's verified cross-linguistically across many, many languages. If you're going to have a plural, you're more and more likely to have it toward the upper end of this continuum and very less likely. In that framework, what English is doing is it's grouping A and B together. It's saying, you know, objects are like animals. They need to be individuated and they need to be pluralized. And the Maya are saying, no, objects are like materials. They're just stuff in the world. They don't need to be that way. And you see those 2 bends. That's the different prediction. And you would expect if you did dozens and dozens of languages and laid their grids on top of each other, you'd get something like the left-hand diagram. But what we're doing is we're picking a place where the 2 languages are really different in how they treat this B category, this objects category, and that's going to be the focus. But as a control, we can also look at the C category, because the C category is where they should agree with each other, okay? And that's another part of the work. So in trying to figure out, well, do people actually think about or look at number differently? I developed some picture stimuli, of village scenes, line drawings. And there's a long song and dance in my books about why I chose line drawings instead of photos or other kinds of things. And you'll see in this diagram that I've got people, a person, and some other animate things, birds. I've got objects like pails and buckets and shovels, and I've got smoke. And what I do, and dirt and so forth, and what I do is I create 3 alternates of this picture in which I add in or take away objects of the relevant type, okay? So in these 3 alternates here, there's a woman shows up putting water in a bucket. In the second picture, you see that one of the buckets vanishes. And in the third one, you see that the smoke, which was abundant in the first picture, becomes less abundant in the second. All right, the material has various ways you can handle it. Now, if this was one picture, you wouldn't make much of it. But if you've got several, if you've got half a dozen scenes or a dozen scenes, and you're adding and subtracting in a counterbalanced way, you're getting an average sense of whether someone now might notice these differences. And there are different ways to do the task. The one I'm going to describe for you now is I show the original picture, I take it away, I shuffle it in with the alternatives, and I show the person each picture in turn and say, is this the one you saw? Okay. And if they notice the difference, they should say no. And if they can't notice the difference, then they're going to say, I don't know, or yeah, it is. Okay. And so what you're testing there is for error patterns. Will they make mistakes in their ordinary understanding of looking at these pictures? I'm going to collapse an enormous amount of data and give you one chart that summarizes the pattern. What this does is it shows you the ratio of material to object errors by age. And if you look at the red line, which is the Yucatec, you'll see nothing changes over the course of their life. They don't treat objects and materials differently, and they continue not to, and they continue not to until they're grown-ups. But the English begin sort of where the Yucatec are, not making any distinction between these 2 things. But by the time they're 9, they're making a lot more errors on material relative to objects. And by the time they're adults, it's way up higher. Okay, so what we see for the English then is a growing sensitivity to number. They have to pay attention to it. And they have to pay attention to it subject to the kind of object that it is. And we find here evidence that they are doing that. Okay, so to hold that thought for a minute, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. I want to look at a second contrast, and that is unitization and object classification. This plural pattern that we're talking about in the first section is accompanied by a second pattern very commonly across languages. The 2 go together very closely. Let me give you the Yucatec examples and then return to the cross-language comparison. I'm going to read these out for you, even though it doesn't mean so much because I help to walk through it. The first line says, 𝗦𝗲𝗍𝗵𝗍, one long thin candle. This is a very normal pattern in this language. You cannot say one candle. You must put the bold item in order to count the candle. And if you said 2 candles, it'd be the same, 𝗭𝗋𝗋𝗋, 2 long thin candles. Now, these have puzzled people in linguistics for a long time. They were saying, well, a candle is, of course, a candle is long and thin. Okay, this was before the age of incensed candles made into bunny shapes and so forth. Anyway, the point is that the candle is long and thin. And so the long thin just seemed to be a redundant marker. It wasn't adding any information. It was something like gender agreement, where, you know, you knew a woman was a woman, you put some marker onto it. You knew a masculine thing had a certain other marker on it. But they did it object for other things too. So it's 𝗦𝗲𝗍𝗵𝗋, one long thin banana. 𝗭𝗋𝗋𝗋𝗋, one long thin banana. What, 2 long thin banana. So they're doing this all the time. And they do it for all nouns. They're doing it for the animals. They're doing it for the objects. They're doing it with have stable shapes. They're doing it for materials, okay? And it turns out that they are meaningful, that if you change the classifier, you change what you're referring to. So 𝗦𝗲𝗍𝗵𝗋 is a one-dimensional banana, which is referring to the fruit because it's long and thin, okay? 𝗦𝗲𝗋𝗋, which is a kind of flat, 2-dimensional thing, would refer how you refer to the leaf. Say, you know, tasten 𝗏𝗏𝗏, bring me 2 leaves. 𝗦𝗏𝗋𝗋 would be the plant in the ground. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 would be a load, like you see people carrying on their shoulders. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 would be a little bit, okay? And it would go on for the other numbers as well. So it turns out these aren't just random agreement markers. They're actually quite important. And we can compare with English, where you can count fine for animals and object, 1 boy, 2 boys, 1 chair, 2 chairs, right? But materials, we do something very similar to the Maya, 1 bag of sugar, 2 bags of sugar, okay? And you can see that we've put in something to modify the sugar. And we even have the thing like with the bananas, you know, 2 grains of sugar, piles of sugar, lumps of sugar, cups of sugar, and so forth. All right. So we have a pattern like the Maya in our language. And we can now reinterpret what the 𝗁 probably means. It probably means one long thin wax or two long thin wax. So the word 𝗁 does not have the shape in it. It only has the material in it. The lexicon is built around the materials, and therefore when you're counting units, you've got to put the unit in, all right? And the unit then will affect the nature of the referent that you're looking at. So let's go back to one of our charts with animals, objects, and materials. We see that on the far right, we're not interested in that so much because the English and Maya agree. And if we look on the other side, there's no agreement, but it's hard to do this experiment with animals. So I'm going to focus just on the middle for what I'm talking about today. Objects in the world, which the English would say, I don't have to mark anything on a unit because it's in the lexeme, all right? And the Yucatec, where it says, no, the unit must be applied because it's not in the lexeme when you're going to count using numbers. The experiment I'm going to deal with is going to play on this by saying some objects in the world are being interpreted as having a shape and others are being interpreted as having a material. Could we get to that with a psychological task of some kind? I designed a series of tasks, but this one is one I'll explain today, where I present three objects to people. And the first object at the bottom, I'll use English here, is a plastic comb with a little handle on it. And to the upper right is a wooden comb with a handle on it. So the shape is virtually identical, but the materials are different. If I look to the left-hand option, they're both made of plastic, but the shape's different because the handle is lacking. Again, if you did just one of these, it wouldn't tell you much. But if you do 20 or 30 of them, and you change the colors, and you change the sizes, and you change the shapes, and change the materials, you can figure out what people are thinking about. And the question you say is this comb in front? You're not using words. You're saying, is this more like this or like that, this? And you're pointing to them, and you're trying to keep it completely neutral in terms of any information. Just, is this more like this or more like this? And there are various ways you can do it with different kinds of words. Is it the same, or is it more like, or whatever? Okay. When we do that, we find the following pattern, that 7-year-olds kind of all agree that the best match here is to the right. That is the shape. But the Maya soon catch on that the language is organized by material. And by age 9, they've flipped up to preferring the material choices. And by adulthood, they're really strongly that way. Now, this will vary a lot by the task. And you can get up 80% in some cases with some tasks. The same exact pattern of results shows up for Japanese speakers, Chinese speakers. It's not specifically Yucatec. It has to do with whether you have these classifier systems which require units because the lexicon is organized more around material than about shape. Okay? We put these two graphs together, the number sensitivity and material sensitivity, you see that the English have to adapt to become sensitive to number in the proper way. And in the other case, the Yucatec have to adapt to become sensitive to material. I want to stress here that there's no right or wrong in these classifications. The world is abundant. It has many things out there, and people are classifying into smaller sets, and they're choosing different ways to reduce the world. And when they reduce the world in this way, they're going to have to conform to that in their speech pattern, and then their cognition apparently will follow along. There's some ethnographic reality to this, which I want to bring up. I would love to talk more about it, but in this context, I see my time, and I'm going to keep moving. People will name new objects that come in by the material. So I had a fellow show up at my door one day and say, can I borrow your gas? And I thought he wanted the kerosene to start a fire. No, he wanted to borrow my Coleman lantern, of which there was one in the village, namely mine, because they were having a dance. But he went by the material that was key to giving the light. I was once leaving the field and collecting trash, and I had a bucket with a couple of holes cut in it, plastic bucket. And one of my informants says, can I have the bucket? And I go, but it's totally useless. It's got 2 giant holes in the bottom. They said, no, but that's good for starting fires. Okay, so they were looking at the objects in this way, something you might normally just not pay any attention to. If we look back to mythology, the Mayan origin stories begin with the various things people were made out of. Until they finally hit on making us out of. I'm currently fascinated by this. If you're portraying plants, let me know if you can't hear me. I got a little, my internet is unstable, notice. People in art will actually use a plant product to portray a plant object and a mineral object to portray a mineral object, something that we would not otherwise have thought even to look for or to make anything of. One of my best examples, and the last one I'll give you, is unexpected sorting. So in some of these tasks, we had them sorting 8, 9, 10 objects and making little groupings and then say, how did you group these things together as similar or not similar? And one day there was at the end, we would occasionally get ones we couldn't understand, and we'd ask somebody and they'd say, well, it makes a pretty pattern or whatever. But one lady sorted stuff in a way we could not figure out. And so I finally said, what are you doing here? And what's the difference between this stack and that stack of objects? And she says, well, this stuff, if you burned it, it would melt. And this, if you burned it, it would turn to ash, okay? This is a very deep and profound focus on the material composition and its potential transformative states. Nothing to do with the shape. I mean, all these things had shapes, right? They were round or flat or whatever. There's a real orientation here that one could do more with. But I just want to indicate this is not just in an experimental context, but in everyday life, interacting with people. Examples come up which now have salience because you've actually thought about this as a potential candidate, okay? So what we can conclude is that language categories differ and affect thought. They involve interrelated lexical and grammatical forms. Where you have the plural, you don't need the unit. Where you have the unit, you don't need the plural. The languages are cohesive in this way. They're not just random. And the effects can appear in many areas of cognition, classification, memory, and daily life. These language effects appear to emerge in middle childhood. Middle childhood is broadly from 6 to 12. The focal period here appears to be age 8. And I'm measuring between 7 and 9 to get these results that you're seeing. It appears to be developmentally significant. That is, at this age, the children are using the symbolic conventions available in their society to guide their individual thought, all right? They're no longer simply psychological, engaging with the world by themselves. They're bringing in this social tool. And it's evolutionarily significant in terms of its timing. This is the end of the distinctive human childhood period. There's a kind of a slowness of growth, a time to acquire cultural and verbal patterns, I think. And we're coming out now with a renewed brain growth. We're coming out with the onset of the sex hormones, the adrenal glands, and we're getting all kinds of changes that are happening at this time. The fact that it's delayed is interesting. It's just the way sexual development is delayed. There seems to be some logic to this that would be worth exploring in detail. This was first brought to my attention by my physical anthropology colleagues at Penn, and it's proved to be very fruitful all the way through in my own thinking about this. In current research, with the time I have left, I want to talk about what's actually happening in middle childhood and first language acquisition, a little bit about second language issues, and then a comment or two on standardization. I have more slides than I can probably use here, but I will at least walk through these. The general pattern in first language acquisition seems to be this, that the early child is collapsing internal reality into a set of categories, into a set of words. They're reducing the complexity of the world into denotational categories that are classifying experience. You can't have a linguistic label for every single object in the world. You must group them in some ways. And when you do that grouping, you're losing information, okay? So there's a kind of reduction in childhood. You have to learn to reduce the world to these sets. But in middle childhood, there's a second thing happening, which is the system of denotation is now being enriched by a system of sense relations. You're learning that these things are dividing the world up in interesting ways, and that you can draw on those ways to get certain kinds of effects. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. So you go from an initial reduction to an enrichment, but the enrichment now is not enrichment from the world, but from the other lexical categories and the other grammatical categories that you have available to you. Let me just give a couple of quick examples here. Vocabulary structure re-explodes at this age. There's an early explosion in the second year of life. There's another explosion now, but I don't think it's based on the brain suddenly getting better. What happens is you've got a matrix of lexical items and there are holes in it. The words you haven't encountered yet for concepts that are implied by the other words that you have. And when you get the word that fits that spot, you go, yes, that's the word, and you have one trial learning of a vocabulary item. If you've ever learned a second language, one trial learning is a great gift if you can have it. But what happens here is that you're in your basic native language, you're filling out a matrix of implied forms that we expect along cognitive and semantic dimensions that we expect. And suddenly kids have a great growth spurt. They get many finer language distinctions. They're suddenly getting, oh, this opposes that, it means this. So the words aren't so isolated, they start to become part of paradigmatic sets. And you start getting sensitive to the this is a material, it's going to go in this category, it's an object, it's going to go in that category. These are beginning to be, they were always there as a language thing, but now they're starting to become really important in a new way in triggering new learning. There's also stuff in the grammatical area. I'm only going to mention a couple here about argument tracking. That is, what's the subject or what's the main focus of what you're talking about. Kids become sensitive to syntactic role. There's a classic study of giving children a sentence of where the ant carried the elephant up the hill, and they're supposed to repeat the sentence back, and they'll inevitably say the elephant carried the ant up the hill. That is, the younger children are going by what's semantically plausible, given their knowledge of the world. The older child realizes that you said the ant in the subject position with the agency carrying the elephant. So however implausible it is, it's now something you can entertain. And based on what the grammar has enriched, you can now say impossible things, all right? That's very important in human cultures, to be able to say things that just might be or could be, okay? They become attentive to the passive voice, signaling role shifts, and they begin to use definite and indefinite articles in a new way. Kids actually don't master in English things like and the until they're almost 10 years old in an adult way. We think of them having it when they're young, but they're working in context with the thing in the room or a thing, okay? To do it out of context in a fully adult form takes them a decade. And so if you're a foreign language learner, as we'll talk about in a minute, if that's hard for you, it's not you, it's really structurally advanced. I want to focus for just a minute. I can't go into this today, but it does seem that the shifter forms, pronouns and tense markers and things like that, that connect what I'm saying with the immediate context. This is really the locus of where the change is happening. Where things used to be anchored in the reality, you can now anchor them in the prior discourse. So the I initially is the I of the speaker, but I can later make it the I of the person I've introduced as the speaker, okay? The tense used to be prior to now, but now I can make it prior to a topic that I'm talking about. And so what's happening then is that the children at this age are taking all the tools they've got for referring to the external reality, and they're now using them horizontally, if you will, to refer to prior discourse that's been established. And this opens them up, as I said at the bottom, here's the key pivot. And it opens them up to things like narratives that are textually cohesive, discourse that frames into international appropriateness with what's been said before, rhetoric aiming at pragmatic effectiveness given the context of use. I often say, if you've ever had a child come home and tell you what happened at school today at age 4, it's a challenge to figure out what actually happened, the order it happened in, who did what, how, what went on. You have to do like a quiz with them, who did that, or who said it, or what did she do first, and all that. By the time they're a 10-year-old, they can come home and give you a narrative. And not only can they give you the narrative, they can organize it in a way that tells you like the powerful line, the bad thing that was done, the way it was done. It's an enormous transformation to be able to use the language effectively in these new communicative ways. And it depends entirely on entering the universe of discourse of the adults and not remaining anchored in the immediate physical situation or some random organization of memory. There are many reflexive functions. I'll just label them here. This is when a kid gets poetics in the sense of plot and genre. Meta-language, they can give definitions. They can source things from reported speech. They can give stance, humor, insult, sarcasm, mockery, teasing, all this comes in. A young kid can insult you, of course. They'll say you have poo-poo face or something like that. All right, they just give you they say a bad thing about you. Oh, but kids at this age, they can say things that are very subtle about, if I had a nose like yours, okay? It involves understanding of the normative conventions, your departure from it, your sensitivity to the department of it, slipping it into the conversation in a way that is maximally hurtful or funny or whatever you're trying to achieve. So kids are so much more sophisticated at this age that we tend to focus so much on the early ages and how amazing it is that they've broken into language. Here they're breaking into discourse in a really powerful way. They've always been there, but now the tools are being used. But what about a second language? A second language is a piece of reality. And when you think about it, you're using the same frameworks, okay? Second language learning in this period becomes difficult. And when you do learn a language after this period, you show the effect of accents. This suggests that something about consolidating the relativity effects and the discourse effects is actually having knock-on effects on your ability to acquire a future language. There are many sources in the literature that are identified for this, okay? Loss of developmental plasticity, interference from entrained habits, interference from trying to translate while you're thinking. But I would argue there's another one, which is interference from first language ontology. Once you commit that this language pattern is the way the world is, then a second language which interferes with the way the world is becomes much more difficult. And you can see, I'm going to skip this particular example and go to this. It's not the same as entrainment or transfer. Learners are evaluating the category meanings of the second language as illogical, arbitrary, unnecessary, clumsy, crazy. These are not judgments about what the category means or how it's used, or even that it's different, but judgments about its appropriateness to the world, its appropriateness to reality. So it does seem that the extra obstacle you have after this age has at least in part to do with the fact that you've run into the fact that the second language doesn't match the world as well as yours. And you're criticizing it. This can happen to us too. Once your first language is ideally fitted, other languages can be evaluated as lacking and inferior, less capable of full and adequate reference, less suitable to science and advanced thought. And we have a long history coming out of the 19th century, with Brinton and others, of saying things about languages that they're inferior in some way. And it's taken us a century to sort of slog our way out of that argument. But it brings us to another question there about the idea that we could have better and worse languages and that we could make language better. And I want to say with my remaining 5 minutes or so, I talk about language standardization. Standardization, in a sense, turns everything on its head. It's opposed to being variable. It's an attempt to reduce or mitigate variation within a language community or to bridge multiple communities. If variation produces relativity, then standardization seeks to reduce it or overcome it, at least within the community. And it can induce its own kind of variation in the community. I've drawn heavily in my thinking on this on Havernak's typology of speech types and their values. The folk type of language is aimed at intelligibility. You use it in a world of your community and your friends to talk about things that are right there and that you care about, okay? The standard adds to this a demand for clarity and definiteness. This is the language of a bureaucracy, a state, a military, a large nation or whatever, where you can't have the immediate intelligibility guaranteed across distance and time. Something that you write down, something that an order you give, you don't want it to be interpreted locally. You want it to be interpreted in terms of a definite clarity. And there's a third level he introduces that he calls the technical, which is focused on accuracy and precision. It's what I'm doing now. It's what we spend our life doing. It's not the standard either. The standard is the default. It's not just among your friends, like the first one, and it's not just among your colleagues and other experts. It's the language you should be able to use in any context because it's marked as clear and definite and not in any way ambiguous. There are lexical and grammatical changes to accomplish this, and we see it really institutionalized with literacy and schooling, all right? It's hard to imagine literacy without some form of standardization. It's got to be read somehow across time and space as the same thing. So I'm going to read this paragraph. Okay, so where everyday language achieves definiteness of reference by a combination of language conventions and appeal to the immediate situation, this rationalized language created within a community seeks to achieve definiteness solely by a use of elaborate set of purportedly decontextualized conventional forms, defined and codified, often by an academy, so as to be generally valid rather than situationally contingent. You get grammars, you get dictionaries, you get experts, you get taught in school what's right and what's wrong, what's proper and so forth. They really are a whole new way of using your base language. It's like learning a second language within your first language, okay? Now, when we use standard in this way, there's often several things we're conflating. One is just homogenizing it across people, all right, to reduce dialect differences or variations in pronunciation or meaning, okay? Another one is to try to get the code out of the context And that's what I've described earlier, is so it will work 10 years from now, I can read your article and understand what you said, okay? But there's a tendency in all of these to also naturalize the code. Well, let's try to make the language more accurate to reality. This is like always an inevitable step of, all right, we got an ambiguity here, let's introduce a distinction, okay? We got a useless distinction, let's come up with a cover term. It's really difficult to get to this latter stages without some kind of formal training. This is what we're in the business of doing to people. It's not just teaching them content. It's really teaching them how to navigate through the language of our area, but the whole society does it for standard, okay? So speakers will require then elaborate training or formal schooling in these conventions in order to be able to understand the code and use it to achieve the goals it was designed for. It's not designed for everyday chit chat, it's designed to get work done. Socially disadvantaged speakers who lack the language skills that are presupposed may be closed out of certain occupational spheres. Socially advantaged speakers who control these patterns, perhaps as native speakers of standard, may have privileged access to such spheres, despite perhaps inferior qualifications in other respects. If you live in a world that speaks standard most of the time, guess what? That's your kid's first language. They arrive at school speaking school language, all right? It's not, and they have to, and they'll find folk language so charming and colorful and everything like that, but they're really just in the same universe as a lot of other people. Are there cognitive effects of having a standard language? Oh my gosh, what a debate. I thought relativity was a minefield until I got into this. There are reputable scholars who will say, yes, it trains you in the intensive use of how to be decontextualized and reflexive. And it creates a dialectic between formal and informal learning. But then you get more extreme views, Hilliard, Mosen. If savage and modern minds are essentially equivalent, it doesn't make any difference that you go to school. What legitimizes the extraordinary efforts in our civilization and others that go to compulsory schooling and to literacy? Why bother if it doesn't really make any difference? Education systems in this view develop intellectual competence that would otherwise go undeveloped. But I want to stress, it's above a base, all right? It's an extra skill set that you're acquiring. And we're claiming here that it makes a difference. No, it's not making a cognitive difference. It's all social. Labov, Bourdieu, you guys will know some of these authors who say school effects are about familiarity with the context of school. Social relations between teachers and students, amount of preschool exposure, command of the standard when you come in, recognition of alternative styles and be able to code switch, authorization to talk, to be a speaker, okay? From this point of view, standard is nothing more than hegemonic practice whereby an elite who's got command of the educational apparatus and the power to enforce its standards is just forcing everybody to talk their way. And you don't really need it to think better, okay? In the world of language standardization, this is often called the cognitive fallacy. It's the view that standard language, this is Joseph who wrote an influential book on this. If the view is that standard language is intellectualized or intellectualized, if that's wrong, then it's really wrong to assume that an individual who speaks a standard is cognitively superior to one that's not. I'll term the equation of a standard language use or capability with higher intellectual capacity to the cognitive fallacy. This seems perfectly reasonable from an anthropological point of view. You do not want to conflate skill set that's highly specialized with higher intellectual value. But Joseph's book, in his hundreds of pages, outlines in detail the long history of developing standards in Europe, each new era building on and borrowing from prior groups. It's a cultural product that took several thousand years for us to develop. And he discusses how contemporary indigenous language speakers come to pursue standards of their language in order to expand its status and power. They recognize that it allows them to do things. So the rejection of difference in capacity, which I think is legitimate, understates the essential utility or functionality of standard literacy and schooling in actual practice of everyday life. I've looked a lot at indigenous standards, and your colleague, Kate Rhodes, has as well. Why do they want a standard? They want the status of being a real lingua, okay? They want to have the people who speak it to be themselves elevated in their social position by having a real language. They want to be able to use their language in education and schooling, in legal courtrooms, in medical practice, and they want control over the teachers, the texts, and the research. This is a recognition, a tacit recognition, that there is power latent in this mode of engagement and they want access to it. Now you could say, well, that power is only there because they're coming into a European influenced world, but that's not the feeling that they have. And there are debates about getting this intellectual power, but it's no longer our language. We've changed it so much that it doesn't feel like our everyday language. And the question of getting this power at the sacrifice of our authenticity, all right? To have an orthographic form that doesn't represent the way we actually think about it. These are all disputes that happen. It's a live issue. So whereas in the United States and other Western European countries, having a non-standard is sometimes viewed as being intellectually inferior, here they've reversed it, that having the standard is allowing you to engage in intellectual and social activities that you otherwise could not without this tool, okay? There are echoes in this line of thinking with the debates in the history of linguistic relativity. And this is my second to the last slide, I'm almost there. First of all, it again argues that language is merely a garb of thought. In this case, its standard is just a way of talking, rather than saying it actually might actually have some effect, okay? And secondly, relativity is just a way to dismiss the thought of certain people as primitive versus seeing it as a way to respect real differences. And we have almost no systematic empirical evidence that actually evaluates this in an even-handed way. It's all politicized in ways that are hard to grapple with. So the claims for how standard language achieves its effects involve the skills that children get in middle childhood. In middle childhood, they all, everywhere I would argue, get the ability to do this decontextualized work, reorienting from the immediate to the systemic discourse. Each culture that wants to can take that skill set and erect on top of it an institutionalized practice. And it raises some questions. If every normal kid has the ability to do this, cognitive and linguistic, then there's the universality and the equity is preserved. But the extent and directions of those developments will vary socially and historically. You can ask whether they're going to be all the same in the way they standardize. But maybe if the functional aims are similar, so are the formal developments. So on the language side, we need to ask whether the standards developed in various languages share more with each other than they do with their spoken vernaculars. There's often a feeling that this is the case when you talk to people, that you can talk to someone down the street from you less well than someone across the world who shares a different standard than you do, but gets the idea of standard. On the cognitive side, we need to ask which aspects of the register actually yield cognitive advantages and which only reflect pre-existing social prejudices and prestige values. And finally, on the social side, we need to ask about equity of access to local standards, given that they're here to stay, and respect to the various standards that might have differences among them. So there you go, 50 minutes, almost. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. And I hope that you were able to see places where the physical anthropologists, the cultural anthropologists, the archaeologists, and the practical interventionists with indigenous languages in particular would see interesting questions in approaching the problems this way. Okay, I'll hand it back to you, Josh.
Great, thank you so much for the wonderful and fascinating talk. So now we have about 8 minutes, and you all are welcome to stay a little bit longer and continue to ask questions past 11. So please send your questions through the chat, and I will field them to Professor Lucy. So we have a first question from Paulina. What age are people considered to be linguistic adults?
Very good question. Linguists don't actually ask this issue. They ask, it's true that you can get a good accent late into your teen years, but I would say somewhere between 10 and 12, most children you could assume have full command of these basic structures that I've talked about. But there are later developments well into the teen years in the ability to tell a compelling story. And what grows, it's not clear it's a linguistic growth or it's a social growth, but you become able to anticipate the other person what's going to move them, what's going to affect them, what's going to surprise them. Okay, so I would say that the initial period before age 8 is giving you the raw materials for discourse. Between 8 and 12, you are consolidating the mechanisms and you're able to talk pretty well. But after 12, up through, let's say, 18 or 20, you are still acquiring the social sophistication now to deploy those new tools in an effective way. So if you want to say technical capacity, I would say 12. But if you're talking to me about total skill, and one linguist, John Haviland, said linguists should spend more time studying virtuosos, real masters of the language, to try to characterize the high-end achievement which is possible in the language, and then you can calibrate people against that standard rather than against the standard of bare intelligibility or something like that. In a culture like our own, I'll add one more detail. If you're an adult and you don't command standard language, people would now say you don't have, you're not fully developed. I would reject that. I would simply say you're fully developed for intelligibility, but you're not fully developed for this kind of decontextualized talk. And so we have set up a double standard where a person's a perfectly good speaker until you change a certain topic field, and then you just lose you and you lose them. Okay. I hope that answered your question. So I say middle childhood, it consolidates by 12.
Okay, we have some other questions here. Let's see. So this is from Jess Dillard. You asked us to hold on to the thought when you discussed the differences in how English speakers and Yucatan speakers put importance on number value of materials, English at a higher rate. Has there been a final conclusion of what social practices may have influenced this?
The reason I asked you to hold it is because it would look like initially that the English changed, not the Maya. And I wanted you to have the second experiment where you saw that the Maya changed and not the English, to indicate that everybody has to move around to accommodate the norms of the system they're in. Obviously, there are interesting questions about what a person can do. I'm convinced that if you sit with somebody long enough, you can get them to understand and see the English patterns, but it's very ephemeral. So the example I would use for you is second language learning. How many of you had the experience of having a rule in class and being able to use it very effectively in class, and then 10 minutes later out on the street, just messing it up again? So there's a real difference here in the capacity to recognize and understand something and the ability to actually fluently use it on case. So I think it's very hard for the Maya to draw this number distinction consistently. It's very hard for the English to ignore it. I mean, when you're learning Maya, it's really hard. And Spanish speakers too, they overmark the plural all the time. It's just wrong. But they do it because coming out of Spanish or English, it's just there. So in speaking, it's really clear. It's a little harder in the cognitive work. There are some students in Yucatan, one of them may be on this call today, who are looking at bilinguals, and the evidence seems to be that they hold on to a Maya sorting pattern even when they're speaking Spanish. All right, so it's a pretty deep and influential thing that we need to explore more. But I hope that answers your question.
So Ian also had a question. I'll just let him ask it.
Sure. I was just wondering if there are any other cultural commonalities besides language similarities among societies that you're aware of with languages that treat animals differently than objects and materials. Like, are we to read into that in some way that could be associated with function or the way they view animals or the natural world or something?
Right, right. There's two answers. One is that there's no obvious cultural, so this works for urban Japanese or Mandarin speakers in China as well as it does for Maya peasants in the Yucatan. So there's no obvious economic thing. At the time I first did this work, many people weren't schooled, and obviously you can take some of these East Asian societies, they're very highly schooled. So I don't think there's any simple cultural similarity which drives it. And in fact, I gave you a three-way division here of animals, objects, and materials. But actually, there's about 10 distinctions along the line where languages tend to cut. So some will pluralize only humans, but not other animals. Others will do large mammals, but not other animals. Others will do animals but only kin, let's say, within humans. So it's kin and then humans and then socially salient animals and then other animals. And then when you get down to the objects, there's ones, well, if it's an implement made by a person, that's different than a naturally occurring object, all right? And then within the naturally occurring objects is the ones that are stable in a real rigid sense and the ones that are more fluid. So if you took that full range, there are languages which cut all the way along that in where they decide the plural or unit is required. And sometimes there's overlap. There are some languages that have no plurals. There are others, purportedly Hopi, which has 3 plurals. But guess what? The animals get all 3, the implements only get 2, and the materials only get 1. So the distinction is that there's an underlying cognitive availability of resources, of possible places you could inflect your language, and people are choosing, because marking all 12 distinctions would just be nuts, okay? And so the compelling communicative demand for some kind of reduction conflicts with the spontaneous visual perception you might have. And early on, they're not in touch with each other. And then after this age, the cultural value of going with the received wisdom for your group becomes very powerful for you. So given the complexity of the linguistics and how far we are from having a full map of it, I would be loath to just say it's animal, not animal, or they all have a different view of animals. If some guy says, there's pig over there, you don't know if it's a dead pig, a live pig. You don't know whether the pig's been cut up already. You know what I'm saying? You don't even know if it's referring to a fat person. I mean, the point is it's just so ambiguous, but in context, totally clear. It's not ineffective in context. Anymore than you say, would you bring me some milk? And you don't have to say a carton of milk or a glass of milk. People know in context. But when you get in these situations, you're revealing that they like material or function over shape or form as a way of organizing the lexicon.
David Dinwoody had a question. Maybe I can just let people ask their questions. Yeah, let's see, I'll just, David, do you want to ask your question?
You have to unmute him.
There we go.
Okay. I feel strange sort of in this black. Is it okay if I turn on the video for just a second?
Yes, no, that's fine. Actually, nice. Hi, good to see you, actually.
Yeah, good to see you, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. As you were talking about standardization and making the distinctions that Havernick makes, I was thinking about my experience trying to understand the grammatical organization of the Chilcotin language, and it's a relatively undocumented language. So obviously it's Athabascan, but it seemed to me that there's a remarkable amount of variation in terms of how speakers would derive particular verbs, or sometimes in terms of the way that they would formulate particular sentences, and I struggled, mightily trying to sort of figure out like what is going on here. How come this person says it like this and this person says it like that? And I think at this point, I've finally kind of given up on trying to figure out, like it seems to me that there's a degree of variation there that maybe reflects this difference between everyday speech versus a standard language. And given my impulse, which was to try to sort of get rid of that difference for a while, is it possible that many of our grammatical descriptions often involve a degree of kind of inadvertent standardization?
I think so. Let me say a little more about the variability. Every child under this vision that I'm presenting is essentially reinventing the language. They come in, they have the model, but they've got to apply it to their world and their experience. If enough of them disagree in the way they apply it with the prevailing norm, the norm changes. But most of them, for obvious reasons, will conform to the norms as they understand them, but it's always as they understand them. So I think every language has enormous diversity. And I have been in endless linguistics talks where somebody will, formal linguistics, you know, someone will say this such and such is not a possible construction. And nowadays you've got people Googling it while they're talking, producing examples of where it's actually used. So there's enormous diversity, and the notion that it's stable is itself an illusion, but it's a useful illusion for people in trying to harmonize their thinking across individuals. And what the children are doing here is they're basically saying, all right, how much of my own view of the world am I willing to give up to enter into this normative system? They're not thinking consciously, but that's what they're doing. And if there's some things that are just a bridge too far, and there's enough of them that think that way, then the language will change. So I think a spoken language without any kind of written representation, or without the imposition of a hegemonic norm, the king's speech or something like that, will have enormously more variation. But the variation is not a problem in context because it's overdetermined by the situation. It's only when you go out of context and you have to be really definite that you've got to really hammer in exactly what you're going to talk about. And so, you know, you grade student essays all the time, and you see the person who doesn't introduce what it is they're then going to refer to, because it's in their mind and they're just referring to it. And it's extremely hard to see that as something that a 20-year-old couldn't do. But it's not that they can't speak. And I know any number of people who've said, you know, I can't tell someone's a non-native speaker until they write via an email or until they compose something, because the oral speech, we're compensating so easily for all the noise and fluff, and maybe you actually meant something different. You know, when I say something wrong in Maya, half the time they think I said something else. Not that I was incorrect, but I meant something else. So I think that the variability is there, and it was a problem for organization of society in certain contexts. And so we invented standardization. You and I are multi-decade veterans of such a thing, and so are our colleagues. So when we try to write the norms, it's very, very hard not to say this is the norm, this is the grammatical norm. But there's the old Sapir quote, you know, if two crows denies this, that there's always variation if someone's going to say that's not right. And I've had this happen with what I considered fundamental categories in the language, causative constructions, where somebody will do it one way and the other guy will do it the other way. And I go, how can you possibly do that? You know, but it's possible because they need something specific in that context, and it gets the work done for them. Yeah, but I don't know what the alternative linguistics would be. I don't think we want to go the way the early botanists did of just presenting each person as their own grammar. I think what we're trying to do is guide somebody who wants to work in the language or understand it by giving them our best guess at what's normative and why it's normative and what deviating from it might signify.
Thank you.
Yeah. My teacher, Norman McClown, used to say, we only want the grammar as anthropologists so we can see the deviations from it because they're interesting. So there's another way to look at it. It's more optimistic.
So I think we can take a couple more questions. So let's see. Josefina Bitar had a question. I don't. Let's see if I can. If you unmute, you can ask your question. Good, great.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful talk. So my question was basically, I work with Paraguayan Guarani, and there are many efforts of standardizing the language. And the rationale for this standardization is often, well, we have to speak it the way it was spoken before contact with Spanish, because Spanish erased all these categorizations and distinctions that we used to have that we don't anymore. So the language has been quote unquote contaminated. So I was wondering what your stance was on this type of motivation to standardize minoritized language. Thank you.
Now, let me understand more clearly. They are saying they used to have these distinctions and they've lost them, or that they must introduce them because, yes, okay. But they've lost them, and so now they're substituting Spanish calcs, let's say?
Right.
Yeah, yep. You know, yeah. I don't know if I have a stance on it. I can tell you what I think often goes on, which is in a lot of languages, which are primarily oral historically, a lot of very subtle distinctions are done grammatically rather than lexically. And in the context situation, the grammatical material erodes a bit, and a lot of extra work is done with the Spanish loanwords. So when the community decides to standardize, they've got this dilemma. They've lost the traditional way of doing it through sort of grammatical inflections and so forth. They've got these Spanish sore spots they would like to get rid of. And so they often invent a new neologism, a new kind of form that's a calque on the Spanish that will get the work done and looks authentic. But of course, it's not the way they used to do it. And that's a real problem. And so in the Maya community, there's a real split now between those who say we should talk as they talk in the rural areas because that's the real deal. But the real deal is highly eroded from what it was 4 centuries ago. And so then there are things you just can't express very well. In a sense, there's been a loss. So I think it's very complicated. The other thing that happens is that native speakers, when they think about standardization, are biased to what in the field is called sounds and nouns. They focus a lot on whose accent's going to be privileged and what orthographic things are going to be done and what nouns are used. And they're often very clueless about a lot of the subtle grammatical things that they use every day, but have no, in Michael Silverstein's term, no conscious awareness of them. And so they don't know it. And so we see this somewhat in like the Tejano literature in the Southwest of the US, where it'll be written in English, let's say, but someone who's a native Spanish speaker can see Spanish constructions under the hood all the way. So it's partly a problem of this. And, but there's nowhere, I think, that the language is standardized that it doesn't change by virtue of the standardization. And so then you get, to go back to David's question, you get people coming in, members of the community, educated members coming in, telling people they don't speak their own language correctly. It's the most disorienting thing. They're native speakers from birth, they're monolingual, and they've got this, usually a school teacher coming in, telling them, you don't speak your language properly. You need to do this, this, and this. Meanwhile, that school teacher, being a bilingual, is bringing a lot of Spanish into their native language and often doesn't understand some of the traditional subtleties that ought to have been in the standardized form. So it's kind of a mess. The only thing I would say is it goes on in English too, and French and Spanish, all right, that we have in our own languages. You're not supposed to do the double negative because of, but lots of languages do double negatives, and it's ancient in English to do it. And the reason they are is because they're at different levels, but since the language has been rationalized to be at one level of reference, they're seen as contradictory. But if they're seen as an emphatic form laid on top of something else that's referential, then they're not at all contradictory. And so you have people, I have a friend who may be listening to see if he's on. We used to have a discussion, why would you say true fact in English? Oh yeah, it's a true fact. Why would you ever say such a thing? I mean, if it's a fact, it's true, right? But it's doing extra work in that context, all right? It's indicating a stance on it. It's surprising, it's unusual. Yeah, anyway, I think watching indigenous language standardization is fascinating as a linguistic anthropologist. It is where the action is right now. The stakes are high. The involvement level in the community is very vigorous. What linguists have to offer is half of the story. And it misses the part that Dave is talking about, is that a certain spontaneous variety is the natural state of languages. And this attempt to harness it is useful. If you're going to be in a medical clinic, you don't want ambiguity. But it's losing a lot. And you see it in our own culture when people will go out. This is, something like Bauman's working. You go out and you listen to native storytellers in rural communities, and their language seems so colorful, so inventive, so interesting, to us, because we've washed stuff out in the interest of clarity. Yeah. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question, except it's a big problem. Yeah.
I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Osborne Pearson had one question. I think maybe that'll be our last question.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. Let me actually pass it to 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 who had maybe a question that might be of more interest to folks.
Okay. Loa?
I think she said that she was going to follow up an email, actually. I don't know.
Ah, is her question noted?
Well, okay, let me ask then. My question was actually about the so-called cross-cultural intelligence tests.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting thing from a few years ago at New Mexico. We had a professor here, Kim Hill, who worked with the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Paraguay. And he tried to administer some of these cross-cultural intelligence tests to 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 men, basically grown people who had worked with in the field doing hunting. And his impression was that they were highly intelligent, highly competent practitioners of the culture and smart. But given these cross-cultural intelligence tests, the results were just abysmal. They were really, really bad. And he was surprised at how poorly this fared. And it really raises questions of why. Why was there this disconnect?
Mm-hmm. I passed very quickly by the Cole and Scribner studies on this issue. That there's two separate problems, of course. The main one seems to be that to even take such a test, you need some familiarity with the modality. And so they did a study, several studies over the years, and they showed that with 1 year of formal schooling, those test scores would change dramatically. And it did not have, I cut this out because I had a whole discussion of this in different talks. It had more to do with being able to do things, understand the set of doing it out of context, dealing with 2D representations on a piece of paper, and so forth like that. So that they basically said there's a set of school conventions. Forget the language for a moment. There's just a set of school conventions, and you have to get into those school conventions to be able to do it. Now, of course, once you're in the school conventions, some of these things seem obvious to you, and you can't understand how anybody could not understand it. The other really great example is a much maligned study, excuse me, by Alfred Bloom, when he was doing research on moral development. And I don't know if you know that research in that area, they present people with these hypothetical scenes and say, what's the right distinction? And he was working in Hong Kong at the time, and they wouldn't accept the premise. They said, well, it's not true. They wouldn't engage the premise, therefore they couldn't possibly exhibit anything. And so he worked on this for a long while, and in the second part of his book, he has a long discussion about how accepting counterfactual premises is actually kind of a sickness in our society, and leads us into all kinds of nutsy things, okay? So yes, it has a power, but it's also got a pitfall, and they're gaining the benefits of not entering into that nutsiness. He was much maligned by certain Chinese speakers, usually American Chinese speakers. I mean, Chinese speakers living in America who are now fully socialized into the American academic life, who said, well, you know, we can say all these things in Chinese very easily. They just have to put the if construction in front of it, but no one actually does that. And no one actually goes out and says, how would you, in Charles Briggs' sense, how would you even ask a question in a society that's a really good question? So an ethnographer who wants to understand something through a question or an assessment device needs to spend a good deal of time asking, what's a fair assessment device, all right? In my work, I used the line drawings because they were familiar in the community from various kinds of health posters over a decade or two. But people couldn't understand photos. So using a photo, or a photo was too specific. You show them a photo and you're asking a question of how many pigs there are or something like that. And they're saying, oh, look, it's my sister so-and-so, or it's my cousin so-and-so. They're completely off on the social dimension of decoding who's actually in the picture. Could care less about your question, all right? And I finally went to actual objects because it was just so hard to get them the material stuff. And so I'm using objects from their community, that for sale in their community, that people know and recognize. But most of the psychological experiments create artificial stimuli which they take in, and to a reliable degree, if you use an artificial stimuli, everybody will go with form, because they don't know what it's for, they don't know what it's made out of, they don't know what it is, and so they just go by the visual evidence of it, and so they all look like 7-year-olds. And if you were doing that kind of thing, right? And we look like 7-year-olds too, but it's like in our language, so it's like okay, all right, and the last thing to say is that working with children is even more difficult. So all these materials I've shown, I had to simplify them for the children to make it accessible to children. I then used the simplified materials with the adults and did the whole thing over again. And I got exactly the same results, but that's another way you can check. If a child can't do this test, then you have to ask yourself what cultural assumptions you've been making that are invisible. And so I find when I present this work that developmental psychologists are by far the most sympathetic of the psychologists, because they're not working with college sophomores to do all their research, right? They're working with little children, and the idea of adapting the stimuli to the level of the expectation set for a 4-year-old is good. And I'm not saying that adults who get those materials are responding at a 4-year-old level. I'm just saying that it helps you see your own cultural biases in it. Anyway, these cultural, there are differences. After all, if you train for 10 years to do abstract problems, you get good at it, okay? So you're in a position of saying, is that worth doing? And I think that what Hilliard and Olson are arguing is, yeah, it's worth doing because in a modern world, you need these skills, okay? But it's maybe not about their native intelligence in a sense that we would think of like that guy's smart and that guy's like a brick, right? And we make these judgments at a personal level, but we don't want to confound individual variation with group classification because we've chosen a poor instrument. So that's my take on it. As you know, it's a controversial field. Yeah, okay. Okay, you have another one that I saw.
So we have one last question from David Hobbs. David, if you want to unmute, you're welcome to ask your question. Great.
Sure. Well, so this was in reference, I think you were giving your answer to David's question, which was on individual variation in language. And you had mentioned that we shouldn't take the view that each individual has their own grammar. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on why.
When, in one sense, until you get to a modern world where people write grammars, there is no grammar. There's just the way a person speaks. And what you do is you sit down and you try to figure out the rules. Since each child is doing it on their own, they are tracking between their own individual thinking and the input they're getting. So the variation can come because their own personal experience is at variance with other people's. It can come because their model is different. Maybe they have a non-native speaker for a parent. Maybe they've got a parent who's very nonverbal in some ways, doesn't speak a lot. Another person is talking all the time. So the kids have different input and they can only build the grammar out of the input that they get, all right? But they all get something. Then as they interact with people in the community, let's say we got 2 different kids who've got somewhat different grammars and they start talking to each other. And they find out that you can say that and I can't. And then either you give yours up because, oh, that's the correct one, or you don't. But you're negotiating the common ground. This is not a given that you have a common grammar. So, for example, I'm of a generation that cannot say, cannot say less marbles. I have to say few marbles. I have a few marbles, or I have fewer marbles. I can't say I have less marbles. Virtually everybody younger than me can say that without batting an eye, okay? They're going to win in the long run in what Spear would call language drift. They've just found the word few as used, and they may use, it's just not useful for them. It's not a distinction that matters to them. There are other languages where that's just baseline. It's always been baseline for centuries. And so they don't have this problem that I have. So I think that it's changes from your individual experience, input from the parents, generational stuff. I can remember a few years ago in grad school when people started talking about the impact of something. I grew up, it had to be impact on something. You couldn't leave the on out. You just couldn't leave it out. Now I don't know anybody who puts it in. All right. And so the point of talking about the individual is it allows this model or this way of thinking to account for 2 things that have puzzled linguists for generation. How would languages ever change? If everybody just conformed to the existing norms, there was a grammar and they all conformed, then the language should never change, okay? On the other side, if everybody's a little different, how do they ever get on the same page, okay? So what I'm arguing is when they get to this middle childhood period, they have to forfeit some of their individualism to enter into the discursive universe. How much of it they forfeit is up to a lot of other circumstances, but they have to give up some of it. They cannot continue using their favorite family word for something forever. They have to give up and use the standard word that everyone else is using for this thing. And, and we get corrected even as adults, and we change. And we have the special standard language problem of having, you know, written pronunciation, where we pronounce it the way we've seen it written for years. And then you finally hear somebody say it out loud and you go, is that what it is? And the other person will say, well, that's how I've always said it. You can sit there and actually have a discussion. What's your authority for saying how this thing is actually said? Since nobody has actually heard it very often. And so I think that it's important that we recognize it. And you can extend this to culture as well, I think. That each child has a different cultural experience, is building on that cultural experience and understanding of how to act in the world. And there's a limit. There's a limit to how far they can go and just being an individual without having some collaborative shared common ground established. But there's a limit on how much the common ground can override the lived experience of actual people. And if the lived experience says something is just not right or not working right or doesn't matter for me anymore, the culture as a whole has to change. So I would say that the key to cultural stability and change is actually in this crucible of middle childhood period, where the child's making decisions that will be in some cases lifelong about what things out of their experience go against the norm and what things in their experience are susceptible to being changed to fit the norm. And so I would say that when you're looking for culture change, this is the age I would look at. Some people might go into adolescence to extend it up to 15 or so. But this, I would focus on the earlier period. I hope that answered your question. It's a bit long-winded, but that's what my thoughts on it anyway. It's not an accident. It's not an accident. It is the way we work. You can't have cultural as an adaptive mechanism if there's no way for it to change. Okay? And it can't be an adaptive mechanism if it can't stabilize and hold belief systems over a period of time. So the fact that it's stable and dynamic are both features and not bugs of the system.
Great, thank you so much for really a fascinating talk, and thank you everyone for your great questions. So that is it for today's colloquium, and I do hope that Professor Lucy will be able to come and speak in person when we get to better times. And thank you everyone again, and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.